The moon was quiet, its surface bathed in the soft glow of a distant star. It was a place untouched by life, barren and cold, with jagged rocks jutting out like broken teeth. In the middle of this desolate landscape, a streak of fire tore through the sky. A small alien spacecraft spiraled out of control, trailing smoke as it plummeted toward the ground. With a deafening crash, the ship slammed into the rocky terrain, sending shards of metal flying in all directions. Inside the wreckage, Lyra lay unconscious. Her shimmering blue skin was marred with cuts and bruises, her delicate limbs twisted at unnatural angles. She was young, barely an adult by her species standards, and frail compared to the humans who had colonized nearby systems. But she wasn't just any alien. She belonged to the Valith, a peaceful race known for their wisdom and connection to nature. And now, she was utterly alone. Lyra's journey had begun weeks ago when her people fled their dying homeworld. Their planet, once lush and vibrant, had succumbed to environmental collapse after centuries of neglect. Desperate to survive, they set off in search of a new home. But their voyage ended in tragedy. Pirates, ruthless scavengers who preyed on vulnerable travelers, ambushed their fleet. Most ships were destroyed, including the one carrying Lyra's family. Only her small transport managed to escape, but not for long. During the attack, her navigation system failed, leaving her stranded light years from safety. When Lyra finally stirred, pain shot through her body. She groaned softly, her large, luminous eyes fluttering open. The world around her was dark and unfamiliar. The air smelled strange, metallic, and sharp. Her heart sank as memories flooded back. The explosion, the screams, the emptiness that followed. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying wouldn't help her now. She had to survive. Using what little strength she had left, Lyra crawled out of the wreckage. Her movements were slow and awkward, each step sending waves of agony through her injured leg. Outside, the harsh winds whipped against her exposed skin, making her shiver. She scanned the horizon, hoping to see signs of rescue or even another living being. But there was nothing, just endless stretches of gray rock and black sky. Hours passed, and Lyra's hope began to fade. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and thirst burned her throat. She collapsed onto the ground, too weak to move anymore. As she stared up at the stars, she whispered a prayer to the ancient spirits her people worshipped. "Please," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "If anyone is listening, please don't let me die here." Unbeknownst to Lyra, someone was listening. Far away, in a human research outpost nestled in a crater on the same moon, Captain Elias Drake sat hunched over his console. His shift was almost over, but something caught his attention, a faint distress signal blinking on his monitor. At first, he dismissed it as interference, but curiosity got the better of him. He adjusted the frequency and traced the source. To his surprise, it led straight to the crash site. Elias hesitated. Protocol dictated that he report the signal immediately, but something about it felt different. Maybe it was the timing, or maybe it was the nagging feeling deep in his gut telling him to investigate. Whatever it was, he couldn't ignore it. Grabbing his gear, he stepped outside, bracing himself against the biting wind. As he approached the crash site, Elias spotted movement among the debris. Squinting, he saw a figure lying motionless on the ground. At first glance, it looked humanoid, but as he drew closer, he realized it wasn't human at all. Its skin glowed faintly, and its features were unlike anything he had ever seen. For a moment, Elias froze, unsure of what to do. Then he noticed the shallow rise and fall of its chest. It was alive. Kneeling beside the creature, Elias examined its injuries. Whoever, or whatever, it was, it needed help. Carefully, he scooped it into his arms, surprised by how light it felt. As he carried it back to the outpost, he couldn't shake the thought that saving this stranger might change his life forever. Little did he know, he was right. Elias moved quickly through the rocky terrain, his boots crunching against the uneven surface as he carried the injured alien in his arms. The creature, Lyra, was lighter than he expected, but her injuries were obvious. Her breathing was shallow, and her glowing blue skin flickered faintly, like a dying light. He tightened his grip, careful not to jostle her too much. Every step felt urgent. Every second mattered. The outpost wasn't far, but the journey seemed endless. The wind howled around him, carrying with it the biting chill of the moon's atmosphere. Elias kept his focus on the horizon, where the dim lights of the research station blinked faintly in the distance. His mind raced with questions. Who, or what, was this being? Where had she come from? And why did saving her feel so important? When Elias finally reached the outpost, he hurried inside and laid Lyra gently on a medical cot. The room was small and utilitarian, filled with basic equipment meant for human use. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He grabbed a scanner and ran it over her body, checking for fractures, internal damage, or anything life-threatening. To his relief, her vitals were stable though weak. Still, there was no telling how her alien physiology might react to human medicine. As Elias worked, Lyra began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises that shimmered like liquid silver. For a moment, she stared at him. Confusion etched across her delicate features. Then fear took over. She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her body, forcing her back down. Her lips parted, and she let out a soft, melodic sound, words in a language Elias couldn't understand. "Easy," Elias said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you." Lyra flinched at the sound of his voice. Her wide eyes darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Panic bubbled beneath the surface, and she struggled again, her movements frantic despite her injuries. Elias stepped back slightly, giving her space while keeping his tone calm and steady. "It's okay," he repeated. "You're safe here." But Lyra didn't seem convinced. In her culture, humans were often portrayed as violent conquerors, creatures who pillaged planets and enslaved weaker species. Seeing one now only reinforced those fears. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered something in her native tongue, her voice trembling. Realizing that words wouldn't bridge the gap between them, Elias decided to act instead. He pointed to himself and said slowly, "Elias." Then he gestured toward her, waiting for a response. After a long pause, Lyra hesitated before whispering, "Lyra." It was progress, however small. Elias smiled faintly, hoping to reassure her. He mined drinking water and held up a canteen, offering it to her. Lyra eyed him warily but eventually nodded. With shaking hands, she accepted the canteen and sipped cautiously. The cool liquid seemed to soothe her, if only a little. Over the next few hours, Elias continued using gestures and simple actions to communicate. He showed her bandages and tools, explaining their purpose through pantomime. Though Lyra remained guarded, her fear began to ease. There was something about Elias, his patience, his kindness, that made her feel less alone. By the time night fell on the moon, or what passed for night, Lyra had drifted into an uneasy sleep. Elias sat nearby, watching over her. He couldn't explain why he felt such a strong connection to this stranger. Maybe it was because she reminded him of himself, lost, broken, searching for hope in a harsh world. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't put into words yet. The next morning, Elias retrieved a translation device from the outpost's storage. It was old and clunky, designed for deciphering ancient texts rather than live speech, but it was better than nothing. He activated the machine and placed it near Lyra, who woke to find the strange contraption blinking and whirring beside her. "What is this?" she asked in her melodic voice. The device processed her words and spat out a rough translation. "What is this?" The next morning, Elias retrieved a translation device from the outpost's storage. It was old and clunky, designed for deciphering ancient texts rather than live speech, but it was better than nothing. He activated the machine and placed it near Lyra, who woke to find the strange contraption blinking and whirring beside her. "What is this?" she asked in her melodic voice. The device processed her words and spat out a rough translation. "What is this?" Elias grinned. "It's a translator," he explained, "so we can talk." Lyra frowned, clearly skeptical. But after a few more attempts, the device began to improve, translating her sentences with growing accuracy. Slowly, they started to piece together each other's stories. Lyra spoke of her people, the Valeth, and their doomed homeworld. She described the attack by marauders, the loss of her family, and her desperate escape. Her voice wavered as she recounted these memories, but Elias listened intently, nodding to show he understood. In return, Elias shared bits of his own life. He told her about Earth, about the military, and about the isolation he'd felt ever since being stationed on this remote moon. As they talked, a bond began to form, a fragile thread of trust connecting two vastly different beings. By the end of the day, Lyra's fear had transformed into cautious curiosity. She still didn't fully trust Elias, but she no longer saw him as a threat. And Elias, for his part, felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. Saving Lyra wasn't just about helping someone in need. It was about proving that even in the darkest corners of the universe, hope could still shine. Neither of them realized how much their lives were about to change. The days that followed were a delicate dance of discovery and adaptation. Inside the small outpost, Elias and Lyra worked to understand each other better. The translation device was far from perfect. Its robotic voice often stumbled over complex phrases, but it became their bridge, allowing them to communicate in ways neither had thought possible. Lyra learned quickly. Her sharp mind absorbed information like a sponge, and she soon picked up basic human words. Food, water, thank you. These simple terms rolled off her tongue with surprising ease. She even tried mimicking Elias's accent, though her melodic voice gave the words an otherworldly charm. For his part, Elias made an effort to learn bits of the Valeth language, repeating Lyra's phrases until he got them right. Their shared laughter during these lessons brought warmth to the cold, sterile walls of the outpost. But communication wasn't just about words. It was also about sharing cultures. One evening, after a long day of repairs and medical care, Elias decided to introduce Lyra to something uniquely human: music. He pulled out an old handheld speaker and played a soft melody, a classical piece by Earth composer Ludovico Einaudi. The gentle piano notes filled the room, creating an atmosphere of calm. Lyra tilted her head, listening intently. Her glowing skin seemed to pulse faintly in rhythm with the music. When the song ended, she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her face. "Beautiful," she whispered, using one of the few English words she knew. Elias grinned back. "Glad you liked it." In return, Lyra offered him a glimpse into Valeth traditions. She taught him how to meditate under starlight, explaining that her people believed the stars held ancient wisdom. They stepped outside the outpost, where the moon's dark sky sparkled with countless pinpricks of light. Sitting cross-legged on the rocky ground, Lyra guided Elias through deep breathing exercises, encouraging him to focus on the vastness above. At first, Elias struggled to quiet his restless mind, but as he gazed upward, something shifted inside him. The stars seemed brighter here, untainted by pollution or artificial lights. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a connection to something greater than himself. When they finally returned indoors, he thanked Lyra sincerely, realizing how much he'd needed that moment of stillness. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, but challenges remained. Lyra's injuries healed slowly, and her alien biology sometimes reacted unpredictably to human treatments. On more than one occasion, Elias found himself scrambling to adjust medications or improvise solutions. Despite these setbacks, Lyra remained resilient, her determination inspiring him to keep trying. One afternoon, While tinkering with the damaged components of her crashed ship, Elias asked Lyra about her home planet. What was it like? He said, handing her a tool she'd requested. Lyra paused, her fingers hovering over the metallic panel. Her expression softened as memories washed over her. It was green, she began, choosing her words carefully. Trees everywhere, tall and strong. Rivers sang as they flowed. My people lived in harmony with nature. Her voice wavered slightly, and Elias noticed the sadness creeping into her eyes. He reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. I'm sorry for what happened to your world, he said quietly. Lyra nodded, blinking away tears. Thank you, she replied. Then, after a moment, she added, but maybe we can build something new, together. The sincerity in her voice caught Elias off guard. He hadn't expected such openness from her so soon. Yet there it was, an unspoken acknowledgement that their lives were intertwined now, bound by circumstance and choice. It was a daunting thought, yet oddly comforting. As the sun, or rather, the distant star, set behind the jagged horizon, casting long shadows across the outpost, Elias realized how much Lyra had changed him. Before meeting her, he'd been adrift, disconnected from everything except duty. Now he found himself looking forward to every sunrise, eager to see what the day would bring. Whether it was fixing her ship, learning a new word in her language, or simply sitting together in silence, every moment felt meaningful. And then there were moments when Elias allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the moon, a future where humans and Valeth could coexist peacefully. It was a bold dream, perhaps even naive, but Lyra's presence made it feel within reach. For now, though, they focused on the present. Each day brought new lessons, new challenges, and new opportunities to grow closer. Neither of them knew what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside, the stars continued to shine, silent witnesses to the fragile yet powerful bond forming between two beings from different worlds. The fragile peace Elias and Lyra had built inside the outpost began to crack when news of the alien crash reached higher command. A routine status update from another station inadvertently included a mention of unusual energy readings near Elias's location. Within hours, an encrypted message arrived on his console, demanding an explanation. The tone was terse and official. Report any unauthorized activity immediately. Elias stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He knew what unauthorized activity meant. Lyra, if he reported her existence, she'd be taken away for study, likely ending up in some cold, sterile lab where scientists would poke and prod her like a specimen. The thought made his stomach churn. She wasn't just an alien. She was a person, a survivor who trusted him. He deleted the message without responding. But avoiding the issue didn't make it go away. Over the next few days, Elias noticed subtle signs that their isolation was about to end. Distant drones buzzed overhead, scanning the area. Supply ships that usually passed by without stopping lingered longer than usual. Even the communications channel crackled with faint voices discussing anomalies. Someone was watching. Lyra sensed the tension in Elias. Though she couldn't understand all the details, she could see the worry etched on his face. One evening, as they sat together repairing parts of her ship, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "What is wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Elias hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. Finally, he sighed and explained the situation as best he could. "People know you're here," he said. "They'll come looking soon. If they find you." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Lyra's glowing skin dimmed slightly, a sign of fear or sadness among her kind. "I do not want to leave," she admitted. "This place. You have given me hope again." Her words hit Elias harder than he expected. For weeks, he'd been focused on keeping her safe, but hearing her express gratitude reminded him why he cared so deeply. He clenched his fists, resolve hardening within him. "You're not going anywhere," he promised. Not if I can help it. That night, Elias devised a plan. He fortified the outpost, setting up traps and alarms around its perimeter. Using spare parts from Lyra's ship, he rigged motion sensors to alert them if anyone approached. It wasn't much, but it bought them time. And time was everything. Meanwhile, Lyra insisted on helping. Despite her lingering injuries, she refused to sit idly by while Elias risked himself for her sake. Together, they worked tirelessly, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. As they labored side by side, their bond deepened further. There were moments of levity too, like when Lyra accidentally triggered one of the alarms, sending both of them scrambling before realizing it was a false alarm. They laughed until tears streamed down their faces, momentarily forgetting the danger looming over them. But the reprieve was short-lived. 3 days later, the scavengers arrived. They came under cover of darkness, their battered ship descending silently onto the moon's surface. These weren't soldiers or researchers. They were opportunists, pirates who scoured abandoned sites for valuable tech. Their leader, a grizzled human named Orc, had caught wind of the crash and smelled profit. What he didn't expect was resistance. Elias spotted their ship on the outpost's radar and cursed under his breath. He turned to Lyra, who stood beside him, her luminous eyes wide with fear. "Stay close," he instructed. "We'll get through this." The scavengers moved quickly, surrounding the outpost with weapons drawn. Rourke himself led the charge, his scared face twisted into a sneer. "Come out," he barked, kicking open the main door. "We know you're hiding something." Inside, Elias activated the first trap, a burst of blinding light designed to disorient intruders. The scavengers stumbled back, cursing loudly. Elias used the distraction to grab Lyra's hand and pull her toward a hidden escape route he'd prepared earlier. But before they could reach it, more scavengers blocked their path. "Nowhere to run, soldier," Rourke growled, stepping into view. His gaze fell on Lyra, and his eyes widened with greed. Well, what do we have here? An alien? This just got interesting." Lyra stepped forward, shielding Elias instinctively. Her voice trembled but carried strength. "Leave us alone," she said, surprising everyone, including herself, with her use of English. Rourke laughed cruelly. "Feisty little thing, aren't you?" Elias tightened his grip on the makeshift weapon in his hand. "Touch her, and you'll regret it," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. For a moment, no one moved. Tension crackled in the air like static electricity. Then, without warning, Lyra raised her hands, and a pulse of bioluminescent energy erupted from her body. The scavengers cried out, temporarily blinded by the intense light. Elias seized the opportunity, grabbing Lyra's hand and dragging her toward the exit. As they fled into the night, Elias couldn't help but marvel at Lyra's bravery. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting back. And for the first time since meeting her, he allowed himself to believe they might actually stand a chance. Behind them, Rourke's angry shouts echoed through the darkness. But Elias and Lyra kept running, hearts pounding in unison. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The escape from the outpost was chaotic, every step a desperate race against time. Elias and Lyra sprinted across the rocky terrain, their breaths visible in the cold air as they pushed themselves to keep moving. Behind them, shouts echoed through the night, angry voices barking orders, boots crunching against the ground. The scavengers were close, too close. Elias glanced at Lyra, her glowing skin dimmed, but still faintly illuminating their path. Her injured leg slowed her down, and though she tried to hide it, pain flickered across her face with each step. He wanted to tell her to stop, to rest, but there was no time. Not now. Instead, he tightened his grip on her hand and urged her forward. "Just a little farther," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. "We can make it." Lyra nodded, biting back the discomfort. She trusted Elias completely, even when fear clawed at her chest. For weeks, he had been her protector, her friend. Now, she refused to let him down. Summoning every ounce of strength, She forced herself to move faster, matching his pace despite the agony radiating through her body. They reached the edge of a narrow ravine, its jagged walls plunging into darkness below. Elias paused, scanning the area for a way across. His eyes landed on an old suspension bridge left behind by previous explorers. It looked unstable, its ropes frayed and wooden planks cracked, but it was their only option. Without hesitation, he led Lyra onto the rickety structure. The bridge groaned under their weight, swaying dangerously with each cautious step. Halfway across, they heard the scavengers closing in. Rourke's voice boomed through the night. "Stop right there. You're not getting away." Elias turned to see flashlights cutting through the darkness, their beams bouncing wildly as the scavengers approached. Panic surged within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Keep going," he shouted to Lyra, who was gripping the rope tightly, her knuckles white. As they neared the other side, Elias spotted something that made his blood run cold. A group of scavengers waiting for them on the far end of the bridge. They were trapped. There was no escape. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm him. Then Lyra spoke, her voice steady despite the situation. "Let me help," she said, meeting his gaze. Before he could protest, she stepped forward, raising her hands once more. A pulse of bioluminescent energy surged outward, engulfing the bridge in blinding light. The scavengers cried out, shielding their eyes as the intensity disoriented them. "Go," Lyra urged, shoving Elias toward the ravine's edge. "I'll hold them off." "No." Elias grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "I'm not leaving you." Lyra shook her head, determination blazing in her silver eyes. "You must. If we both stay, neither of us will survive." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to find another way. But deep down, he knew she was right. Every second they delayed put them both in greater danger. Reluctantly, he nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "Promise me you'll follow," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise," Lyra replied, her voice soft but unwavering. With one last glance at her, Elias leaped off the bridge, landing hard on the rocky slope below. Pain shot through his legs, but he ignored it, scrambling to his feet and disappearing into the shadows. As he ran, he heard the sound of splintering wood, the bridge collapsing under the weight of the scavengers' confusion. When the noise faded, Elias stopped, leaning against a boulder to catch his breath. His heart hammered in his chest, not just from exertion, but from the weight of what he'd done. Leaving Lyra behind felt like tearing a piece of himself apart, but she had promised to follow. He had to believe she would. Back on the bridge, Lyra stood alone, her chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through her veins. The scavengers were regrouping, their leader shouting orders to surround her. She knew she couldn't fight them all, but she didn't need to. Not if she bought enough time for Elias to get away. Summoning every bit of courage, Lyra focused her energy, channeling it into another pulse. This one was stronger, brighter, sending waves of light cascading over the ravine. The scavengers stumbled backward, blinded and disoriented. In the chaos, Lyra slipped away, climbing down the ravine's steep walls with agility that surprised even herself. By the time the scavengers recovered, she was gone. Elias waited anxiously near the rendezvous point, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Minutes felt like hours as he scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of her. Just when doubt began to creep in, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. Lyra limped toward him, her glowing skin dim but unmistakable. Relief washed over Elias as he rushed to her side, steadying her as she collapsed into his arms. "You did it," he murmured, holding her close. "We made it." Lyra smiled weakly, exhaustion etched across her face. "Together," she whispered. Though they were safe, for now, the ordeal had taken its toll. Both were battered and bruised, their bodies pushed to the limit. Yet, amidst the pain and fatigue, a newfound resolve burned within them. They had faced death and survived, proving that their bond was stronger than anything trying to tear them apart. As they rested briefly before continuing their journey, Elias realized something profound. Protecting Lyra wasn't just about saving her life. It was about protecting the hope she represented. Hope for unity, for understanding, for a future where beings like her didn't have to fear those like him. And as long as he drew breath, he vowed never to let that hope die. The aftermath of their narrow escape left Elias and Lyra battered but alive. They found temporary shelter in a shallow cave hidden among the jagged rocks, its entrance obscured by overhanging boulders. The air inside was damp and cold, but it offered a brief reprieve from the scavengers still searching for them. Exhaustion weighed heavily on both of them, yet neither could afford to rest, not while danger lurked so close. Elias tended to Lyra's injuries first, his hands trembling slightly as he cleaned cuts on her arms and legs. Her earlier display of bioluminescent energy had drained her, leaving her weak and pale. Despite this, she remained alert, her silver eyes scanning the darkness outside the cave. "They will come again," she said softly, her voice tinged with resignation. "I know," Elias replied, tying off a makeshift bandage. "But we've got the advantage now. They don't know this terrain like we do." Lyra nodded, though doubt lingered in her expression. She trusted Elias implicitly, but even his confidence couldn't fully erase the fear gnawing at her. For all her resilience, she was still just one alien against an entire crew of ruthless scavengers. And Elias, though brave and resourceful, was only human. As they sat together in silence, Elias began formulating a plan. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, the scavengers would corner them. If they were going to survive, they needed to turn the tables, to fight back on their own terms. But how? Their resources were limited, and their weapons rudimentary at best. Then it hit him: the outpost. Though abandoned now, the outpost still contained valuable equipment, tools, spare parts, and most importantly, access to the communications array. If Elias could reach it undetected, he might be able to send out a distress signal or disable the scavengers' ship remotely. It was risky, but it was their best shot. When Elias shared his idea with Lyra, she hesitated. "It is too dangerous," she argued, gripping his arm tightly. "If they catch you." "They won't," Elias interrupted, his tone firm. "I'll move fast and stay hidden. Besides, I can't let you go back there. You're in no condition to fight." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Trust me, okay?" Lyra wanted to protest further, but she saw the determination in his eyes. Arguing wouldn't change his mind. Instead, she nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Please." With a final glance at her, Elias slipped out of the cave, disappearing into the shadows. Moving silently, he retraced their steps toward the outpost, avoiding open areas where scavengers might spot him. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind that sent shivers down his spine. Every sound made him tense, every shadow seemed to shift unnaturally. But he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that Lyra's life depended on him. Back at the cave, Lyra waited anxiously, her glowing skin dimmed to avoid detection. Time crawled by agonizingly slowly, each second stretching into eternity. She tried to distract herself by focusing on the stars visible through the cave's narrow opening, recalling the meditation techniques she taught Elias. Yet, no matter how hard she concentrated, worry consumed her thoughts. The aftermath of their narrow escape left Elias and Lyra battered but alive. They found temporary shelter in a shallow cave hidden among the jagged rocks, its entrance obscured by overhanging boulders. The air inside was damp and cold, but it offered a brief reprieve from the scavengers still searching for them. Exhaustion weighed heavily on both of them, yet neither could afford to rest, not while danger lurked so close. Elias tended to Lyra's injuries first, his hands trembling slightly as he cleaned cuts on her arms and legs. Her earlier display of bioluminescent energy had drained her, leaving her weak and pale. Despite this, she remained alert, her silver eyes scanning the darkness outside the cave. "They will come again," she said softly, her voice tinged with resignation. "I know," Elias replied, tying off a makeshift bandage. "But we've got the advantage now. They don't know this terrain like we do." Lyra nodded, though doubt lingered in her expression. She trusted Elias implicitly, but even his confidence couldn't fully erase the fear gnawing at her. For all her resilience, she was still just one alien against an entire crew of ruthless scavengers. And Elias, though brave and resourceful, was only human. As they sat together in silence, Elias began formulating a plan. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, the scavengers would corner them. If they were going to survive, they needed to turn the tables, to fight back on their own terms. But how? Their resources were limited, and their weapons rudimentary at best. Then it hit him: the outpost. Though abandoned now, the outpost still contained valuable equipment, tools, spare parts, and most importantly, access to the communications array. If Elias could reach it undetected, he might be able to send out a distress signal or disable the scavenger's ship remotely. It was risky, but it was their best shot. When Elias shared his idea with Lyra, she hesitated. "It is too dangerous," she argued, gripping his arm tightly. "If they catch you." "They won't," Elias interrupted, his tone firm. "I'll move fast and stay hidden. Besides, I can't let you go back there. You're in no condition to fight." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Trust me, okay?" Lyra wanted to protest further, but she saw the determination in his eyes. Arguing wouldn't change his mind. Instead, she nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Please." With a final glance at her, Elias slipped out of the cave, disappearing into the shadows. Moving silently, he retraced their steps toward the outpost, avoiding open areas where scavengers might spot him. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind that sent shivers down his spine. Every sound made him tense. Every shadow seemed to shift unnaturally. But he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that Lyra's life depended on him. Back at the cave, Lyra waited anxiously, her glowing skin dimmed to avoid detection. Time crawled by agonizingly slowly, each second stretching into eternity. She tried to distract herself by focusing on the stars visible through the cave's narrow opening, recalling the meditation techniques she taught Elias. Yet, no matter how hard she concentrated, worry consumed her thoughts. The scavenger's fury burned brighter than ever after Elias and Lyra's daring escape. Rourke, their ruthless leader, paced back and forth in the outpost's dimly lit control room, his boots scuffing against the metal floor, his scared face twisted with anger as he barked orders at his crew. "Find them," he snarled, slamming a fist onto the console. "I don't care how long it takes or what you have to do. That alien is worth more than all of you combined." Elias and Lyra, hidden deep within a narrow crevice carved into the moon's rocky terrain, listened intently to the distant shouts echoing through the night. Their breathing was shallow, their bodies pressed close together to avoid detection. The scavengers were combing the area systematically now, their searchlights cutting through the darkness like knives. "We can't stay here," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. He glanced at Lyra, her glowing skin dimmed to a faint shimmer. She nodded, understanding the urgency. They had evaded capture once, but luck wouldn't save them forever. As they crawled out of the crevice, Elias outlined his next plan. The scavenger's ship was grounded thanks to his sabotage earlier, but it wouldn't remain disabled indefinitely. If they wanted to ensure the scavengers couldn't pursue them, or worse, call for reinforcements, they needed to destroy the vessel entirely. However, reaching it would require navigating an open stretch of land heavily patrolled by guards. "It's too dangerous," Lyra protested quietly, gripping his arm. "They'll see us." "I know," Elias admitted, his jaw tightening. "But we don't have a choice. If we don't take them out now, they'll keep coming after us." Lyra hesitated, torn between fear and determination. Finally, she sighed. Then I will help. Together, they devised a strategy. Using materials salvaged from the outpost during their previous escape, Elias fashioned crude explosives, small but powerful enough to cripple the scavenger ship. Meanwhile, Lyra volunteered to create a diversion using her bioluminescent abilities. Her energy pulses could blind and disorient their enemies, giving Elias the time he needed to plant the charges. Before parting ways, Elias pulled Lyra aside, his expression serious. "If anything goes wrong, run," he instructed, his voice firm yet gentle. "Don't wait for me." Lyra shook her head, her silver eyes blazing with resolve. "No, we are stronger together, remember. I won't leave you behind." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For so long, Elias had carried the weight of survival alone, believing it was his duty to protect others without asking for help. But Lyra had shown him that strength wasn't about going it alone. It was about trusting someone enough to share the burden. He nodded, unable to argue further. Under the cover of darkness, they'd put their plan into motion. Lyra moved first, slipping silently toward the edge of the scavengers' camp. When she reached a vantage point overlooking the ship, she raised her hands and unleashed a brilliant pulse of light. The effect was immediate. The scavengers cried out in confusion, stumbling backward as the blinding glow overwhelmed their senses. Seizing the opportunity, Elias sprinted toward the ship, clutching the makeshift explosives tightly. His heart raced as he darted between shadows, avoiding the few scavengers who hadn't been fully incapacitated by Lyra's attack. Reaching the ship, he worked quickly, planting the charges near critical systems. Sweat dripped down his brow as he set the timer, knowing he had mere minutes to get clear before the explosion. Just as he finished, chaos erupted behind him. Rourke, recovering faster than expected, spotted Lyra retreating from her position. With a roar of rage, he charged after her, weapon drawn. Elias froze, torn between completing his mission and rushing to her aid. "Go!" Lyra shouted, noticing his hesitation. She turned to face Rourke, raising her hands again. Another pulse of energy surged outward, forcing him to shield his eyes. But this time, the effort left her visibly weakened, her knees buckling beneath her. Elias didn't hesitate any longer. Ignoring the danger, he bolted toward Lyra, tackling Rourke just as the scavenger leader lunged at her. The two men grappled fiercely, exchanging blows in a desperate struggle. Rourke was larger and stronger, but Elias fought with everything he had, driven by the need to protect Lyra. Finally, Elias landed a solid punch, knocking Rourke unconscious. Gasping for breath, he grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her to her feet. "We need to move now," he urged, dragging her away from the scene. Behind them, the explosives detonated with a deafening boom. Flames erupted into the sky, illuminating the night as the scavenger's ship was consumed in the blast. Cheers of triumph died on their lips as Elias and Lyra stumbled into the safety of the shadows, collapsing against each other in exhaustion. For a moment, they simply sat there, catching their breath and watching the firelight dance across the horizon. Though battered and bruised, they felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage and unity could prevail. As Elias wrapped an arm around Lyra, pulling her close, he realized something profound. This fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that love and trust could overcome hatred and greed. And as long as they stood together, no force in the universe could tear them apart. The destruction of the scavenger's ship marked a turning point, but Elias and Lyra knew their troubles were far from over. The explosion had drawn attention, not just from the remaining scavengers, who now regrouped with renewed determination, but also from distant authorities monitoring unusual activity on the moon. Time was running out. They needed a way to leave this hostile place before they were either captured or killed. Elias sat cross-legged on the cold ground inside their makeshift shelter, staring at the damaged components of Lyra's crashed spacecraft spread out before him. Each piece represented a challenge, a puzzle to solve if they hoped to repair it. But the task felt insurmountable. The ship's core engine was beyond salvaging, its intricate alien technology too advanced for human tools to fix. Without it, flying anywhere seemed impossible. Lyra knelt beside him, her glowing skin dimmed by fatigue but still radiant in the dim light. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, sensing his frustration. "We will find a way," she said softly, her voice steady despite the odds stacked against them. "I hope you're right," Elias replied, rubbing his temples. "But even if we manage to patch this thing together, we'll need rare materials, stuff that isn't exactly lying around here." Lyra tilted her head thoughtfully. "What do you need?" Elias sighed and listed off the items: crystalline alloys for the engine housing, energy conduits capable of channeling high-frequency power, and a stabilizer module to regulate the ship's systems during flight. These weren't things he could scavenge from the outpost or the scavenger's wreckage. They'd have to venture into uncharted regions of the moon, areas known for treacherous terrain and dangerous wildlife. When Elias explained the risks, Lyra insisted on accompanying him. "You cannot go alone," she argued firmly. "If something happens to you—" Her voice trailed off, but the unspoken fear hung heavy between them. Elias wanted to protest, knowing how much strain she'd already endured. Yet, seeing the determination in her silver eyes, he relented. "Fine," he said finally, "but promise me you'll stay close and let me handle the hard parts." Lyra smiled faintly, though her expression remained resolute. "Deal." The next morning, they set out under the pale glow of the twin moons, heading toward a jagged mountain range rumored to hold mineral deposits rich in crystalline structures. The journey was grueling, every step testing their endurance. Sharp winds whipped across the barren landscape, carrying with them biting cold that seeped through their clothing. Rocks shifted beneath their feet, threatening to send them tumbling down steep slopes. Despite the harsh conditions, Lyra proved invaluable. Her keen senses detected subtle changes in the environment, warning signs of approaching storms or hidden predators lurking nearby. More than once, her quick reflexes saved them from disaster, whether it was dodging falling debris or spotting a venomous creature camouflaged among the rocks. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner, making each breath harder to take. Elias pushed forward relentlessly, driven by the knowledge that failure meant staying trapped on this unforgiving moon forever. He carried most of the weight, refusing to let Lyra bear more than she could handle. Still, her presence gave him strength, reminding him why he couldn't give up. After hours of climbing, they reached a cavern nestled within the cliffs. Inside, glittering crystals jutted out from the walls like frozen stars, casting prismatic reflections across the space. It was breathtaking, but also perilous. The floor was uneven, littered with loose stones that shifted dangerously underfoot. Worse, strange sounds echoed through the cavern, suggesting they weren't alone. "Stay alert," Elias whispered, gripping a makeshift spear tightly as they ventured deeper. Lyra nodded, her hands raised slightly, ready to unleash another pulse of bioluminescent energy if necessary. They worked quickly, chipping away at the crystals and collecting samples of the materials they needed. Just as they were about to leave, a low growl reverberated through the chamber. From the shadows emerged a massive creature, part insect, part reptile, its armored body gleaming menacingly in the dim light. Its multifaceted eyes locked onto them, and it lunged with startling speed. Elias reacted instinctively, thrusting the spear forward to fend off the attack. The creature recoiled momentarily, giving Lyra time to act. Raising her hands, she unleashed a concentrated burst of energy, blinding the beast long enough for them to retreat. Heart pounding, they scrambled out of the cavern, clutching the precious materials tightly. Once outside, they collapsed onto the rocky ground, gasping for breath. Despite the danger, they shared a triumphant smile. Their mission had been successful. Back at the shelter, Elias immediately began integrating the new components into Lyra's ship. Progress was slow, but with each passing day, the vessel took shape, transforming from a wreck into something resembling a functional spacecraft. Through it all, Lyra stayed by his side, offering encouragement and assistance whenever she could. Their bond deepened further, forged not only by shared hardship, but also by the unwavering belief that they would escape this moon together. And yet, as the final pieces fell into place, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't be easy, not emotionally. This desolate world had become home because of Lyra. Wherever they went next, he knew one thing for certain. Their journey was just beginning. The repairs to Lyra's ship were nearly complete, but the weight of their impending departure hung heavy in the air. For weeks, Elias and Lyra had fought side by side, survived unimaginable dangers, and forged a bond that transcended species and circumstance. Now, as they stood on the brink of leaving the moon behind, both felt a mix of hope and uncertainty. Elias tightened the last bolt on the engine housing, his hand smeared with grease and sweat dripping down his face. He stepped back, wiping his brow with the sleeve of his jacket, and surveyed the ship. It wasn't perfect. Patches of scorched metal still marred its surface, and some systems flickered unpredictably. But it was functional, enough to get them off this barren rock. Lyra approached him, her glowing skin dimmed but steady, reflecting the calm determination she carried throughout their ordeal. "It is ready," she said softly, her voice tinged with awe. "You did it." "We did it," Elias corrected, smiling faintly. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Her lips curved into a small smile, though sadness lingered in her silver eyes. She glanced around at the outpost, the jagged landscape, and the stars above. This place had been her prison, yet it had also become a sanctuary, a place where she'd found friendship, trust, and love. Leaving it meant stepping into the unknown once more. As they prepared for liftoff, Elias made one final decision. He couldn't let Lyra face the universe alone, not when he had promised to protect her, not when she had become such an integral part of his life. Summoning every ounce of courage, he turned to her and spoke the words he'd been holding back. "I'm coming with you," he said firmly, meeting her gaze. Lyra blinked, startled. "What?" "No, Elias, you belong here. Your world, your people." "My people aren't here," he interrupted gently. "They're light years away, and honestly, I haven't felt like I belonged anywhere for a long time. But with you," he paused, his voice softening. "With you, I feel like I'd finally found where I'm meant to be." Tears welled up in Lyra's eyes, shimmering like liquid starlight. She reached out, placing a trembling hand on his cheek. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Once we leave, there's no turning back." Elias nodded without hesitation. "I've never been surer of anything in my life." Their preparations continued under the cover of darkness, knowing the scavengers could return at any moment. Elias packed what little supplies they had left, while Lyra programmed the ship's navigation system using coordinates from her memory. They aimed for a distant planet rumored to be safe, a neutral zone where humans and aliens coexisted peacefully. It was a gamble, but it was their best chance. Just as they finished loading the last of their gear, a familiar sound echoed through the night, a hum of engines. The scavengers had returned, their patched-up transport ship descending onto the moon's surface not far from the outpost. Rourke's voice crackled over a loudspeaker, taunting them. "There's nowhere left to run, soldier. Hand over the alien, and maybe we'll let you live." Elias clenched his fists, anger flaring within him. "Over my dead body," he muttered under his breath. Lyra grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the ship. "We must go now," she urged, her voice urgent. Together, they sprinted across the rocky terrain, dodging blasts from the scavengers' weapons. Bullets whizzed past them, kicking up clouds of dust, but they refused to slow down. Reaching the ship, Elias climbed aboard first, helping Lyra inside before sealing the hatch behind them. As the engines roared to life, Elias took the controls, his hand steady despite the chaos outside. The scavengers surrounded the ship, pounding on its hull and firing wildly. But it was too late. With a deafening roar, The vessel lifted off the ground, shaking violently as it ascended into the sky. Through the cockpit window, Elias watched the moon shrink beneath them, its jagged surface fading into the void of space. Beside him, Lyra gripped his hand tightly, her glowing skin brightening with relief and joy. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were free. But freedom came with challenges. As the ship hurtled through the stars, navigating uncharted territory, Elias and Lyra faced new questions about their future. Where would they settle? How would they adapt to a world neither fully understood? And most importantly, how would others react to their bond? Despite these uncertainties, one thing remained clear: they had each other. Together, they had overcome impossible odds, proving that even in the darkest corners of the universe, hope could shine brightest. As the ship drifted further into the vast expanse of space, Elias leaned back in his seat, exhaustion washing over him. Lyra rested her head on his shoulder, her breathing slow and steady. For now, they allowed themselves a moment of peace, a brief respite before the next chapter of their journey began. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly, silent witnesses to the courage and love of two beings who dared to defy the odds. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The journey through space was long and uncertain, but it carried Elias and Lyra farther from the desolation of the moon with each passing day. The ship hummed softly as it sailed through the endless expanse of stars, its systems holding steady despite their makeshift repairs. Inside, the two travelers found solace in each other's company, their bond growing stronger with every shared moment. Lyra spent much of her time teaching Elias about the universe beyond Earth, about planets teeming with life, cultures rich with tradition, and histories spanning millennia. She spoke of her people, the Vailith, who once thrived in harmony with nature before their homeworld succumbed to ruin. Her voice carried both sorrow and hope, painting vivid pictures of a future where such tragedies could be avoided. Elias listened intently, captivated by her stories. In return, he shared tales of Earth, the bustling cities, vast oceans, and humanity's relentless drive to explore. Though his world seemed chaotic compared to hers, Lyra marveled at its complexity and resilience. "Your kind is remarkable," she said one evening, gazing out at the swirling nebula outside the viewport. "You create beauty even amidst destruction." Her words filled Elias with pride, though they also reminded him of humanity's flaws. He knew all too well the greed and violence that had nearly cost Lyra her life. Yet, looking at her now, glowing softly in the dim light of the cabin, he felt a renewed determination to prove that humans were capable of more, that love and unity could triumph over hatred. As days turned into weeks, the ship finally approached their destination, a lush, vibrant planet known as Solara Prime. It was a haven for beings from across the galaxy, a place where diversity wasn't feared but celebrated. From orbit, the planet looked like a jewel suspended in space, its surface covered in sprawling forests, shimmering lakes, and cities built seamlessly into the natural landscape. When they landed, Elias and Lyra stepped onto the soil of their new home, breathing in air that smelled sweet and fresh. Around them, creatures of all shapes and sizes moved freely, coexisting without conflict. Humans mingled with aliens, exchanging goods, ideas, and laughter. For the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't outsiders. They belonged. Building a life on Solara Prime wasn't easy. They faced challenges adapting to the customs and languages of its inhabitants, but their shared determination saw them through. With help from local artisans, they constructed a small home nestled within a grove of luminescent trees. It blended elements of human architecture with Vailith design, symbolizing the union between their worlds. One evening, as they sat beneath twin moons casting soft light over their garden, Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple ring he'd crafted during their journey. Made from fragments of the crystals they'd collected on the moon, it shimmered faintly, catching the glow of Lyra's skin. "Lyra," he began, his voice trembling slightly, You've given me something I never thought I'd find again. Hope. You've shown me that no matter how broken things seem, there's always a way forward if you have someone to walk beside you. He took a deep breath, meeting her luminous eyes. Will you marry me? Tears welled up in Lyra's eyes as she stared at him, her heart swelling with emotion. She nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Elias. Always. They embraced under the starlit sky, their hearts beating as one. Their wedding ceremony, held weeks later, became a celebration not just of their love but of unity itself. Beings from countless species gathered to witness the union of a human and a Violet, their differences bridged by trust and compassion. In the years that followed, Elias and Lyra dedicated themselves to fostering understanding between species. They opened a cultural center where humans and aliens could learn from each other, sharing knowledge and traditions. Their efforts inspired others to embrace diversity, creating ripples of change that spread far beyond Solara Prime. On quiet nights, they would sit together beneath the stars, reflecting on how far they'd come. From the wreckage of despair, they had built a life filled with purpose and joy. And though the universe remained vast and unpredictable, they faced it unafraid, knowing they had each other. For Elias and Lyra, hope wasn't just a fleeting dream. It was a promise kept alive by love. Together, they proved that even in the darkest corners of existence, light could shine brightest when nurtured by those brave enough to believe in it.